Hello, my name is Kelly. I'm going to be discussing how we use MAD, or mean absolute difference, to examine comparisons between two maps whose attributes include a directional variable and a measure of magnitude, also known as vector variable maps. So this is an explanation of research done in a study by Dr. Rahul Rakshit and Dr. and Professor Gil Pontius. A special thanks to the National Science Foundation, who supported this work with the Long Term Ecological Research grant and also the Coupled Natural Human Systems grant. So first off, what are vector variable maps? Well, they're maps whose attributes are vectors, and vectors have both a direction and a magnitude. They're commonly used in wind velocity maps, ocean current maps, and aspect maps, which show slope direction on a topographical surface. So a wind velocity vector map example is what we see in this image. We see little arrows over North and South America and also the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. And those arrows are showing us the direction that the wind is blowing, and their length indicate how strong the wind is or how fast it's blowing in miles per hour at each point. Here we see an example of two aspect maps, both using the Rook's case and the Queen's case. We see the slope maps above them. Aspect maps are derived from slope maps. This is another way we can use MAD, and in fact, it was this example that we used to conduct this study of using MAD to compare two different vector maps, one using Rook's case and one using Queen's case. Why? Well, Drs. Rakshit and Pontius said that there's a need for methods to quantitatively compare differences between two maps showing a directional variable and its magnitude. So the paper, or the study, answers what's an appropriate way to measure these differences, and also how do these differences change when our spatial resolution changes. Here are the results. This is the first case where we compared Queen's case aspect map and a Rook's case aspect map at 30-meter resolution. So what this plot is telling us is on the x and the y axis we have 0 to 360 degrees. Each point corresponds to the same pixel on both maps, and how both maps interpret the angle of the vector at that pixel. So for instance, let's look at this little point right here. Map 1, the Queen's case, says that that vector is 240 degrees, and the Rook's case says that that vector is 90 degrees. This gives us a quantitative expression of how our two maps are different from one another. Please draw your attention to the corners where we see these collection of points. That just is the point where in map number 1, our Queen's case, a pixel is registered at 360 degrees, and in the Rook's case, map number 2, it is registered at 0. Okay, so how did we get the results that are shown above? First, let's talk about Queen versus Rook and what that means. So when we're creating aspect maps from elevation and slope data, it's important to have a set algorithm to calculate that. So we see in these two pictures two chessboards. The first we see a queen, and the second we see a rook, also known as a castle. The queen can move anywhere, forwards, backwards, north, south, east, west, and on the diagonals, whereas your rook can only move north, south, east, and west. So when we're calculating aspect, that number for each pixel is calculated by referencing all of the angles in all of the pixels around it for queen. And for rook, that number is calculated using the reference angles in the pixels due north, due south, due east, and due west. So because one example includes the corners and the other example doesn't, you can imagine that there will be some differences between these two maps. This is a short example. We see the aspect for Queen's case and Rook's case. It's mostly the same if you direct your attention to this top right-hand corner in the Queen's case and in the Rook's case. We see that this is pointed a little bit northeast and this is due east. That demonstrates some of the differences. The equation for MAD comparison is done in 3 steps. First, we are going to standardize and coarsen the angles. This just means that we're going to make sure that all of our angles are measured from due north going clockwise. Step 2, when we compare our 2 vector angles from our Rook's case and our Queen's case map, we want to make sure that we are selecting the minimum difference between each. When you're working with a polar coordinate system such as this, the difference between 2 vectors, in this example, can be 10 or 350. Both of them are correct. So what this equation does for d sub nr is it finds the minimum value of the difference between our 2 vectors. Next, we're going to use MAD, or mean absolute difference, of all of the d sub nr's for each pixel, and we're going to sum all of that up and divide it by the sum of the weights. W sub Rn is the weight for pixel, n at resolution R. Next, how does changing the resolution influence the results? Well, we can see as our resolution decreases, or the size of our pixel increases here, we see more agreement between our 2 maps. This is to be expected. There's more coarsening in our angles. We see that this line becomes thinner as we move along until it's almost in perfect agreement. And then in this final map, it was a test to see how do the maps compare when there are only 4 pixels in the entire map. This demonstrates how you need to choose between a high resolution, such as over here, and high accuracy between 2 different maps. There's many reasons why we might want to change the resolution at all. Most of it has to do with when you're working with maps in practice. You might be getting 2 different maps from 2 different sources, and you need a common sense way to measure the differences you might have between these 2 sources. We see that as we coarsen and increase the pixel size, the mean absolute difference decreases. This was shown in the other graphs. We see almost an exponential decrease in mean absolute difference. This is between slope as a function of resolution, and this is an aspect as a function of resolution. Previous studies done to compare 2 vector maps include work done by Skidmore, who used the Spearman's rank correlation coefficient, Acadia, who just subtracted the differences, the absolute differences. I want to direct your attention to Batra and Hesselink, who used the Earth Mover's Distance algorithm, and also Thiesel, Rossel, and Siddell, who used fluid flow map differences. This presentation is derived from a paper called Methods to Compare Raster Maps that Show a Vector Variable, and it was written by Drs. Rakshit and Pontius. And special acknowledgement to Drs. Rakshit and Pontius for doing this report, and also to the National Science Foundation. Thank you.